Hey everybody, it's Jean. I'm here to talk to you about a topic that's going into the Jumpstart tonight. I know the Jumpstart doesn't start until February 15th, but we're throwing some bonus content in there. And this week's bonus content is wedding budgets. They are one of the biggest factors in your wedding planning and are directly related to how stressed out you will be. Your wedding budget can be done thoughtfully in a way that makes sense. And in the Jumpstart, I'm going to show you all the insider tips and tricks and give you the good secrets on how to do it in a way that will save you time, money, and stress. The wedding budget can be a huge challenge for couples, but if done right, you're going to make financial decisions for the rest of your lives together perfectly. Wedding budgets are one of the most important aspects of planning your wedding, and it's probably one of the first things you and your soon-to-be spouse are going to discuss in terms of your wedding. The biggest factor in determining your wedding is going to be your guest count, but there are really some things before you even get there that you and your intended should discuss, not just with each other, but if needed, with other people who might also be contributing to the wedding. The best advice I can give you for your wedding budget is to avoid going into debt to plan your wedding. You are unlikely to make back in gifts what you spend on your wedding. So just be careful about putting things on credit cards. Unless you're using them to pay down immediately and earn points, it's never a great idea to start off your marriage by going into debt to get married. One of the best ways to avoid going into debt is to give yourself as much time to plan and save as possible. So in order to do this, book your venue as far in advance as you possibly can. You and your fiance may decide to book your venue without talking too extensively with others who are involved in paying for the wedding, but it's not a bad idea to get them involved and let them see the venue. If they don't like it, they can't say much after you've already booked it, and they absolutely love it and know that it's a stretch for your budget, that may be the time at which they begin to talk about helping out. Another time to discuss who is and isn't contributing for a wedding is while you're working on your guest list. I'll give you an example. Richie and I got married, and when we were planning, we had a very small list of what we called our VIP guests. And so this list was the people that we could not imagine getting married without having in attendance. And to be honest, it was small. It was about 60 people. It wasn't much. And we actually ran into some problems with our planning because a lot of venues did not want to accommodate such a small event, and certainly not on a Saturday. And that's something we'll talk more about in the venue presentation coming next week. But we came up with this VIP list, and we talked to our parents about it to kind of double check that we weren't leaving anybody really important off. And Richie's parents looked at the list and asked if they could add some people. Those guests fit in the venue. And then they very generously offered to cover the cost of those guests coming to the wedding. We made the same offer to my parents, and my parents were like, nope, we're good. We're fine. And we're just excited to come to the wedding, and the list you guys wrote is good for us. But this kind of conversation is really important to have. You don't want to start off your married life with anyone feeling like they've been slighted by the guest list. Couples go about doing this in different ways, but it's really kind of a group project to kind of figure out who is going to be on your guest list and how big your guest list is going to be. If your venue is small, there are hard decisions to be made. And if your venue is huge, they become more expensive decisions to be made. So having this conversation as early as possible is always a great idea. The biggest budget factor is always going to be your guest count. But there are other things that also affect your wedding costs, and location is key. The time of year is important, and the day of the week is important. More and more, you will find couples taking advantage of out-of-season wedding dates that are later in the fall, closer to winter, New Year's Eve, holiday weekends, things like that. I have a friend who got married on Super Bowl Sunday because their venue could not book that date, and they got an amazing deal by booking that day. Then they had to have a few football favors, and they put a big screen in the lounge. But you have to do things sometimes if that's going to help your bottom line. So you may have a dream venue that you wouldn't be able to afford on a Saturday night in their prime season. But if you pick one of their slightly off seasons and go with a Sunday, a Friday, or even these days, a lot of people are getting married on Thursdays, you will save significantly. So one of the things that you have to be really careful is to keep in mind the big picture of your budget. Do not get caught up in thinking of your cost in terms of your per guest expense. Some wedding budget items are fixed and some are not. A fixed cost is photography, videography, planning. These are things that are going to cost what they cost, no matter how big or small your wedding is. Per guests and costs are going to include things like catering, liquor, stationery, centerpieces, things that the more guests you have, the more money you're going to have to budget towards those items. So just keep in the back of your head that while there are some areas of your wedding that you want to talk about or think about in terms of per guest spending, many of them are not. One last thing I would like to warn you about in terms of your budget's big picture is not going on to Google or Pinterest and searching for what things should cost or what percentage of your wedding budget certain categories should be. These percentages and costs are skewed by so many different factors: location, experience, and especially the size of your guest list. So if you are planning a $30,000 wedding, that guest count that you have is going to skew the percentage of the cost of everything, as opposed to if you were planning on spending a lot more, say $100,000 on your wedding, the percentages would totally be skewed because of this fixed cost versus per guest cost items. So just be careful about Googling things like, how much should I be paying for centerpieces? You're going to get a million answers and none of them are going to be right. So just be forewarned that that's a difficult way to go about budgeting. Here's a list of different types of weddings from most expensive to least. The most expensive type of wedding is a tented wedding at a venue or at a home. You're very likely going to have to build yourself a wedding venue if you decide to use a tent. You'll need to bring in tables, chairs, sometimes bathrooms, electricity, kitchens, and tents for cooking. And it can get incredibly expensive very, very fast. Down at the bottom of the list, you'll notice that the most affordable type of way to get married would be a small wedding, a courthouse, more along the lines of an elopement, where you have your ceremony and then follow that up with a dinner party. Somewhere in between, you'll find all different kinds of venues, but typically wedding venues with a site fee and a catering minimum are then followed by non-wedding venues like a yacht club, a library, or a museum that includes a site fee to rent the venue, and then you bring everything in. And then there are the more traditional wedding venues that do or don't have liquor licenses. Those kind of come out the same depending on what type of liquor you want to provide for your guests. Here's a list of all the different items that will most likely go into every wedding budget, more or less. I'm not going to read through the list for you, but if you go into the Jumpstart's Facebook page and go under the unit for wedding budgets, you'll find a worksheet that will allow you to kind of plan out and sketch your wedding budget in terms of these items. I'll include in that worksheet some notes about different ways to price out these items. And in the next few slides, we'll get into them in more detail. These are items that do not go into your wedding budget. Most people do not include in their wedding budget their engagement party or their honeymoon costs, their rehearsal dinner or their after party, post-wedding day brunch, and whether or not they pay for hair and makeup for their entire bridal party or if they just do it for themselves. But these are all things to consider perhaps in your overall budget if they're things that you're going to be doing. For ceremony and reception budgeting, you really need to keep in mind before you go shopping what a site fee is. That is the fee you pay to rent a venue. Whether or not that venue has a minimum requirement is going to affect your budget. You also want to look at the venue's rain plan. If the venue doesn't have a good rain plan, that is something you might have to pay for. And it may not be possible to pay for it, and so that might be a reason to cross that venue off your list. But you could consider other options and pay a small fee to host your ceremony there if it rains. You sometimes will find venues that tell you that their rain plan is to hold the ceremony inside the reception space, in which case they would flip the room. A room flip is where during cocktail hour, they're going to switch that room from being the ceremony to the reception. You can also add a tent to a wedding venue or to a facility to help accommodate your guests, either as a rain plan for ceremony or for dinner or something like that. But it does increase your space. You just have to consider permit fees, sound ordinances, space. Are there gas lines where you're going to put the tent? The venue will be able to help you with that. Catering and food is one area where I see couples often have a problem with their budget. And the problem is this. When you see budgets advertising or listing on their website the amount of money that they are charging per guest for a certain catering package, they're not adding into it tax and gratuity. So in New Jersey, 6.625% tax must get tacked on. So that right there, if you were spending $100 per guest, would increase your per guest cost to $106.625. When you add gratuity, you add that to the $100. You don't pay it on the tax. So let's work with 20%, although typically it's anywhere between 20 and 22, and it will be in your contract. You don't have a choice about this. You have to add that on to the $100 per guest cost as well. So by the time you add in tax and gratuity, you actually need to budget $126.26 per guest, not the $100 per guest that the venue, caterer, or wedding facility advertised. And so if you forget tax and tip and you're paying $100 per guest and you have 100 guests, at the end of your budgeting, when your final number comes in, you could be off by thousands of dollars, $2,000 or $3,000 based on just those numbers. So imagine what it would look like if you were spending $200 per guest and you were having 200 or 300 people. It could be a huge budgeting mistake. So keep this in mind when you are looking at venues, and then when you are crafting your budget, you really need to factor in tax and gratuity. I want to encourage you very strongly, if you're able to pick your caterer, to go with one who is full service and one is not. You need to look very carefully at your contracts. There is a difference between sit down and buffet, but there is a point at which a buffet becomes more expensive than a sit down. And we'll talk more about that in our catering session in the Jumpstart. You also want to look at minimum guarantees. And a minimum guarantee is where you have to give the caterer or the venue the minimum number of guests you are going to pay for on your wedding day. That's a difficult number to come to if you're venue shopping without having looked at your guest list. So if you lowball the number, the venue is going to be unhappy because at the last minute, they have to scramble and find staffing. And if you highball the number, you're going to be stuck paying for meals for people that may not have come to the wedding. So you want to figure that out ahead of time and think about it a lot before you go to the venue and negotiate your minimum. Liquor and bartending is definitely one area of your contract, certainly with liquor, where you will have some wiggle room. You can swap out certain brands, you can limit your bar menu to beer and wine, you can do things like that that will help you lower your costs if that's your goal. But I will encourage you to make sure you take a look at your contract to know how many bartenders are included in your package. And there's usually a line in most venue contracts that says if you go over a certain number of guests, you will have to have additional bartenders. My general rule of thumb is every 50 guests, get a bartender. So if you have 200 people at your wedding, you need 4. This is to avoid lines at the bar. Dessert is another part of your wedding where you may have dessert included in your catering or venue package. Typically speaking, it's a standard cake where you will have a number of design options. You can kind of spruce them up with a cake topper or some fresh florals. And if you don't like that option, you can choose to do cake from somewhere else. I'm not going to talk too much about this tonight because Denise from My Daughter's Cake is our cake expert in the Jumpstart, and she is definitely going to spend some time talking about different types of wedding cakes and what to be on the lookout for. But you're going to want to include dessert in your budget. If you want to do something in addition or instead of cake, you're going to want to find out what those costs involve. If you are interested in wedding planning, the cost of wedding planning will depend enormously on the planner's experience, location, and any travel and accommodations needed. If you are considering a destination wedding, and by that I mean in New Jersey, Cape May, or Long Beach Island, you really want to strongly consider a planner who is familiar with those areas. I specialize in Long Beach Island. I did one wedding last year in Cape May, and I can tell you from personal experience how much more difficult it was for me to plan a wedding outside of my vendor network. So you are probably going to work to your advantage by choosing a planner near where it is that you are planning your wedding. Wedding photography is something that you have to budget for. And same with videography, which we'll talk about again in a second. But there is one universal truth. It is completely worth it, and memories are irreplaceable. At the end of your wedding, the only thing you will walk away with, aside from a husband or a wife and a marriage certificate, all very important, are the photographs and the video of that event. Videography considerations, and Steph from Tone Media is going to talk a lot more about this, but they're based on experience and location, time and editing, whether or not they have a second shooter, the number of hours they'll spend at your wedding. But they also very much so depend on what is being produced for you. Is it going to be a 4 or 5 minute highlight video? Or is it going to be a full-on film-length wedding movie extravaganza? So you need to know those things, what you want up front, and then factor those into the price. One of the things that's really important with both photo and video is that when you are pricing out different packages from different photographers and videographers, it's very difficult to compare one person's package to another. It's like comparing apples to oranges. Very few are going to have the exact same packages with the same things in them. So you want to be very careful about looking at what the bottom line price is. If it's low, but you have to add on a ton of things to equal what another package includes, you have to consider that when you're looking. Hair and makeup. Liz from the Updo Guru is our expert hair and makeup. Liz does on-site hair and makeup for weddings. And so that's a little bit different than going to a salon, but there's a lot of different things that you want to consider, and she will talk a lot more about those. Wedding day attire is something that you want to take a look at and put into your budget. This is a tough one, and for those of you buying a wedding dress, it can be really tough. I knew going into my wedding day that I was probably going to spend more than my sister had spent on her wedding dress. And she was very lucky. She was able to walk into a large wedding dress chain and grab a dress off the rack, and it fit her like a glove, and she looked absolutely stunning, and she adores that dress to this day. I was not going to be that lucky. So I knew I was going to enjoy the boutique experience and the shopping, and that I was going to spend a little bit more, but I still was very reasonable in what I planned on spending. Although I do think I had a moment where I told my husband while we were engaged that he should be prepared, because if the dress that made me feel perfect and gorgeous cost twice what we were budgeting, I was going to get it anyway. Thankfully, that didn't happen, but you have to be kind of that's one area where you have to be very thoughtful. Wedding bands are another item that you'll want to make sure that you include in your budget. Custom designs will be a factor. The more custom, the more expensive, but really the cost depends most on material and the types of stones that you're using. Jamie from Ceremonious Strings is going to talk to you all about wedding entertainment, ceremony entertainment, cocktail hour, reception, DJ versus band, after the party, the after party entertainment. These are all things that we will tackle in the wedding entertainment unit of the Jumpstart, but need to be included in your budget. Also, your wedding officiant, Chris Bruno, is going to talk in the Jumpstart about why you may or may not want to hire a wedding officiant. If you're getting married in a church, it's likely that you're going to be using a religious person to perform your ceremony. But if you're not, you do have other options: a wedding officiant, a family friend. Chris is going to talk about how she plans wedding ceremonies. A family friend or family member is a good idea. It will save you some money, but they will not help you write your ceremony. And if they're not experienced in weddings or talking in front of large crowds, you could make for a really awkward ceremony. So that's something to definitely consider. Wedding flowers and decor. Again, the guest count factors in here with the number of centerpieces, and that's going to really impact your floral budget. You can repurpose florals from ceremony to reception, not to cocktail hour, because you can't move them in an instant. They take time to move. So you can move them during cocktail hour from the ceremony to the reception, but you also need to make sure you know who is going to do that for you. You'll also want to include in your budget money for a guest book, card box, table numbers, and signage. So these are all things that you want to make sure that you budget for. Wedding rentals could also, if you notice there's an asterisk by card box and table numbers, that's because I wanted to mention that you could rent those if you wanted to. But larger wedding rentals include things like photo booths, and we're going to have Jen from the VW Booth Bus, and she and her husband also own a roving bar, which is a Prosecco truck, talk about some of these other kinds of rentals that you can bring in. I love the VW photo booth bus because it eliminates from my floor plan in the reception space a photo booth. It brings guests outside, and in the case of many waterfront venues, it brings them outside to the fresh air and the view. So that's something to kind of keep in the back of your head. But other wedding rentals might include upgraded table settings like chargers and fancy silverware and beautiful glassware, farm tables, different types of chairs, and ceremony decor. Wedding stationery is going to be something that Lisa from Art Paper Scissors is going to tackle. So again, this is a fixed and non-fixed cost. It is a lot of it going to depend on your guest count, but it's also going to depend on what I would consider the bells and whistles of your wedding invitation. What are you adding to it? What are you doing? So Lisa's going to talk a lot about that. Wedding day transportation is going to be, how are you going to move your bridal party? And how are you going to move your guests? And I am going to do a bonus unit on this. Not everybody includes wedding day transportation. Most people will, but I'm going to put it in a separate unit. Additional expenses like favors and gifts for your parents and bridal party, travel and accommodations if you need to go to your wedding and stay overnight. And then insurance. Venues will often require liquor liability insurance if they don't have a liquor license. And you very well may want to consider getting wedding insurance. And we'll talk more about that in one of our bonus units. One of the most overlooked wedding expenses is tips and gratuities. This is something that I get for every single wedding, a question around 2 weeks out. How much and who do we tip? So I'm going to be sharing with you later on in the Jumpstart a unit on tips and gratuities. It'll probably get tucked within the budget category, but we'll dive much, much deeper into how much and who and how do you deliver your tips on your wedding day. And so that's it. That kind of brings us to the tail end of your wedding budget. We'll dive a lot deeper into a lot of these different categories, but I hope you found this useful, and you need to jump into the Jumpstart, see what I did there, and grab your worksheets that go with this PowerPoint so that you can use them to plan out your wedding budget.